There is a specific pattern of experience that every soul who has made genuine progress on the Gnostic path encounters. It is so consistent, so recognizable, so precisely predictable within the framework of Gnostic cosmology, that the tradition gave it a name and developed specific counter-practices for navigating it. The pattern is this: at precisely the moments when genuine recognition is most available, when the pneumatic spark's self-awareness is at its most developed, when the soul is closest to the quality of gnosis that the entire path has been building toward, the resistance intensifies, not randomly, not in proportion to the external difficulty of the practitioner's circumstances, in direct proportion to the depth of the recognition that is becoming available. The Gnostic tradition called this the invisible war, not a metaphor for the general difficulty of the spiritual path, a specific description of the Archon system's targeted response to the development of genuine gnosis. Within a specific soul, the system does not apply equal pressure to all souls equally. It applies its most sophisticated pressure to the souls that are closest to the recognition it most needs to prevent. And the pressure it applies at the advanced levels of genuine recognition is qualitatively different from the pressure it applies at the earlier levels. More interior, more subtle, more precisely calibrated to the specific vulnerabilities that the soul's genuine development has simultaneously created. This is not a teaching designed to generate fear or paranoia. The tradition was explicit about this. The invisible war is not the sign that you have failed or that something has gone wrong. It is the sign that something has gone right. The intensification of Archon resistance is, paradoxically, one of the clearest indicators that genuine recognition is developing, rather than the sophisticated psychic experience that the counterfeit light specializes in producing. The Archon system does not intensify its pressure against psychic spiritual experience. It generates that experience. It intensifies its pressure against pneumatic recognition because pneumatic recognition is the one thing the Archon system cannot generate, cannot replicate, and cannot recover from once it becomes established in a specific soul. Tonight we name the invisible war precisely what its specific forms are at the advanced levels of genuine recognition, why the tradition understood them as signs of progress rather than failure, and what the specific counter-practices are that the Gnostic communities developed for protecting the developing light against the most sophisticated forms of Archon interference. The first form of the invisible war at the advanced levels is what the Gospel of Philip calls the counterfeit spirit's activation of spiritual pride. The soul that has made genuine progress on the Gnostic path has developed something real. The pneumatic spark has been recognized, however partially and however imperfectly. The quality of interior attention has genuinely deepened. The Archon mechanisms of desire and fear and identity have genuinely loosened their grip, at least in specific dimensions. The soul knows more, sees more clearly, inhabits its inner life with more genuine recognition than it did before the practice began, and the counterfeit spirit's most effective tool at this stage is the subtle conversion of that genuine development into something that serves the Archon system rather than threatening it, the identity of being spiritually advanced. The soul that has made genuine progress is the soul most susceptible to the specific form of Archon conditioning that the Gospel of Philip calls the garment of shame worn in reverse. Not the shame of being too little, but the pride of being more than others. The sense of having access to understanding that most souls do not have. The specific spiritual hierarchy that places the awakened above the unawakened, and uses that placement to maintain the ego's sense of specialness at the very moment when genuine gnosis requires the dissolution of the ego's authority over the soul's experience. The Gnostic tradition's counter-practice for this form of the invisible war is precisely what makes it recognizable as a genuine counter-practice rather than a moral injunction. It is not the cultivation of humility as a performance, but the recognition that the spiritual identity itself is an Archon construction. The soul that has made genuine progress is a soul that contains more genuine light, and more genuine light means more capacity for genuine recognition, not more justification for a more refined spiritual ego. The counterfeit spirit activates exactly at the point where genuine light has developed enough to be genuinely attractive to the ego's hunger for specialness. Recognize it. See the spiritual pride as the Archon mechanism it is. The recognition is itself the counter-practice, not the suppression of the pride, but the seeing of it as a mechanism rather than a truth about your elevated status. The second form of the invisible war is what the Pistis Sophia calls the activation of the soul's own fears at the moment of closest approach to genuine gnosis. The Pistis Sophia describes this in the context of Sophia's laments, her accounts of what happens each time she approaches a genuine recognition of her own divine nature and finds the Archon powers intensifying their pressure against the approach precisely when she is closest. This is not the general fear that the Archon mechanisms generate as part of their ordinary operation. It is a specific targeted, heightened fear that arises precisely in the interior moments when genuine recognition is most available. The specific form this takes in the practitioner's experience is the fear of losing what the genuine recognition would require losing, not the ordinary fear of external loss. The fear of losing the self, the specific configuration of identity, narrative, spiritual achievement, and relational position that the soul has constructed and that genuine gnosis, at its deeper levels, threatens to dissolve. The soul that is closest to the recognition that the Archon-managed self is not what it is will experience, precisely at that moment, an intensification of the investment in the Archon-managed self, an urgent sense that the dissolution the recognition requires would be catastrophic, would leave nothing in place of what was dissolved, would strip away not the false identity, but the soul itself. The Gnostic counter-practice is not the suppression of this fear, or the forcing through of the recognition against the fear's resistance. The counter-practice is the recognition of the fear as a sign, the specific recognition that the soul is close enough to genuine gnosis for the Archon system to be deploying its most interior weapon. The fear of dissolution at the threshold of genuine recognition is the Archon system's most precise indicator that the threshold is actually present. When the fear of losing the self intensifies in the interior space where genuine recognition should be arising, that is the moment to be more patient, not less, to hold the approaching recognition with the quality of gentle attention, rather than forcing it through the intensifying resistance, trusting that the intensity of the resistance is itself the confirmation that something genuine is available. The third form of the invisible war is the one the Gnostic tradition was most careful to document precisely, because it is the form most capable of permanently derailing a genuine practitioner, the substitution of external conflict for internal recognition. The soul that is developing genuine gnosis is the soul that has begun to see through the Archon mechanisms clearly enough that those mechanisms are no longer operating entirely below the threshold of consciousness. They are visible. The desire is recognizable as desire rather than genuine need. The fear is identifiable as an Archon mechanism rather than an accurate assessment of reality. The identity narrative is perceptible as a construction rather than a truth. And the Archon system's response to this visibility, to the specific threat that conscious recognition of the mechanisms represents, is the generation of external conflicts, relational pressures, and practical crises that redirect the practitioner's attention from the interior work of genuine recognition to the external management of situations that suddenly seem to require all available energy. This is not the ordinary difficulty of life that every soul navigates. It is a specific intensification of external demand that arises in direct proportion to the depth of the interior work, the Archon system's most effective and most widely deployed countermeasure against the development of genuine gnosis. The Gnostic counter-practice for this form is the most demanding of all the practices the tradition developed, because it requires maintaining the interior recognition precisely under the conditions that seem most to justify abandoning it. The practice is this. When external conflict intensifies exactly as interior recognition is deepening, recognize the pattern, name it as the invisible war's third form, and commit, in the specific conditions of the intensifying external pressure, to maintaining the quality of interior attention that the external pressure is designed to disrupt. Not by neglecting the external situation, the Gnostic tradition was not otherworldly in the sense of abandoning practical responsibility. By refusing to allow the external situation to completely consume the interior space that genuine recognition requires. Maintaining the thread, however thin, however inconveniently present amid the external demands. The thread is what the Archon system is targeting. Protect it. I have created a free guide to accompany this teaching. It is called The Invisible War, a Gnostic practitioner's guide to protecting the developing light. Inside you will find the specific counter-practices the Gnostic communities developed for each of the three primary forms of Archon resistance at the advanced levels of genuine recognition, drawn directly from the Gospel of Philip the Pistis Sophia and the Zostrianos, and presented not as historical curiosities, but as the practical tools they were designed to be. The link is in the description below. The fourth form of the invisible war, the one the tradition reserved for the most advanced practitioners because it requires the most advanced recognition to navigate, is what the Apocryphon John calls the counterfeit spirit's activation at the moment of apparent arrival. The practitioner who has navigated the spiritual pride, the fear of dissolution, and the external conflict with sufficient genuineness to continue deepening the interior recognition, will eventually reach a moment in which the recognition feels complete. The seeking has apparently ended. The finding seems to have occurred. The pneumatic spark has apparently recognized itself with a depth and stability that the entire path was building toward. And the counterfeit spirit makes its most sophisticated and most dangerous move. It confirms the arrival. It produces a quality of interior certainty that feels from within the experience of it, exactly like the genuine gnosis the entire path was pointing toward. Not because the arrival is false. The soul that has genuinely navigated the first three forms of the invisible war has made genuine progress toward real recognition. But because the Archon system's final tool is the specific form of spiritual certainty that converts genuine progress into a stopping point rather than a deepening. The certainty that you have arrived when the arrival the tradition was pointing toward is one that produces not certainty, but the specific quality of transparent, non-grasping, non-claiming awareness that the Apocryphon of John calls the invisible spirit's nature. The genuine Monat consciousness does not feel certain. It does not feel like anything the ego can recognize as achievement. It is simply present, simply aware, simply what remains when every form of spiritual identity, including the identity of having genuinely arrived, has been released. Protect your light not by defending it, but by continuing to release what is not it. The invisible war is not the sign of failure. It is the precise measure of how close to genuine recognition you actually are. The closer you are, the more precisely calibrated the resistance becomes, and the more specifically the resistance itself is pointing at what it is trying to prevent you from recognizing. Use the resistance as a compass. Where the Archon pressure is most specifically and most subtly applied, that is where the genuine light is most available. Move into that territory. Practice the recognition the resistance is pointing at by attempting to prevent it. The invisible war cannot win unless you stop. Subscribe to the Gnostic Archive, where we name the war's forms every week, because naming them is half of the protection, and the other half is the practice that the naming makes possible. The Gnostic tradition developed a specific vocabulary for the experience of the invisible war that is worth examining precisely, because the vocabulary itself is a counter-practice, a way of naming the forms of Archon resistance that simultaneously identifies them and begins the process of dissolving their authority over the soul's experience. The primary term is epithymia, desire in the specific sense of the compulsive reaching that the Archon system generates to consume the soul's attention. But the Gnostic texts are careful to distinguish between the ordinary operation of epithymia, the background desire that runs through most moments of ordinary experience, and the intensified epithymia that arises specifically in response to the development of genuine gnosis. The intensified form is what the tradition calls the war, the specific activation of desire that arises not from ordinary material circumstances, but from the Archon system's recognition that genuine recognition is developing, and that the most effective countermeasure available is the redirection of the soul's attention toward the objects of intensified desire rather than toward the interior recognition that the practice was building toward. The counter-practice is not the suppression of the desire. The Gnostic tradition was consistent in recognizing that suppression feeds what it suppresses. The counter-practice is the recognition of the intensification pattern. When desire intensifies precisely as interior recognition deepens, that specific coincidence is the invisible war making itself visible. Name the pattern. Do not fight the desire, see it as the Archon system's countermeasure, accurately identified, which removes the need to either indulge it or suppress it. Simply recognized and named, the intensified desire loses the specific authority it carries when it is taken at face value, rather than seen for what it is. The tradition also gives specific guidance on the social dimension of the invisible war, the dimension that the practitioner is most likely to underestimate because it is the most exterior and therefore seems least connected to the interior work. The Gospel of Mary encodes this dimension in the conflict between Mary and Peter, the conflict between the soul that has received genuine transmission and the institutional consciousness that cannot accommodate that reception. Every genuine practitioner on the Gnostic path will eventually encounter the specific form of this conflict in their own life. The community or relationship that was supportive of the early stages of the practice becoming progressively less comfortable with the deeper stages. The institutional consciousness, the Peter consciousness, whether within a formal institution or within the informal communities and relationships that every practitioner inhabits, has a specific tolerance threshold for the development of genuine gnosis. Up to a certain point, it welcomes and supports the practice. Beyond that point, it begins to resist. The resistance takes the form that Peter's resistance takes, not theological argument, not considered critique, but the specific discomfort of a consciousness that senses that what the practitioner is developing is something it cannot contain. Did he really speak with her without our knowledge? Did he prefer her to us? The questions beneath the resistance are: does the transmission you are receiving threaten the authority structure we have built together? Does your development require that we revise our shared understanding of who has access to what? And the answer that genuine gnosis always gives, not as a social position, but as a cosmological fact, is yes. The transmission follows the readiness, not the appointment. The pneumatic spark receives from the pleroma, directly, without the mediation of any community consensus about who is authorized to receive it. And that direct reception is, by its nature, disruptive to every social structure built on the premise that spiritual authority is collectively administered. The Gnostic counter-practice for the social dimension of the invisible war is Levi's counter-practice in the Gospel of Mary, the naming of the resistance as the adversary's pattern, the holding of the genuine transmission's authority against the institutional challenge, and the commitment to what the transmission requires, rather than what the social consensus can accommodate. Not in the spirit of social rebellion. The Gnostic tradition was not interested in institutional warfare for its own sake. In the spirit of the precise recognition that the Archon system operates through social consensus as readily as through interior mechanisms, and that the protection of developing light requires the willingness to hold its reality against the institutional pressure to reduce it to something the institution can manage. Your light is real. The war against it is real. And the counter-practices the tradition developed, the recognition of spiritual pride as an Archon mechanism, the holding of the fear of dissolution as a sign of proximity to genuine recognition, the naming of external conflict intensification as the invisible war's third form, the refusal to accept apparent arrival as permanent completion, and the naming of social resistance as the adversary's pattern rather than the community's authority. These counter-practices, applied consistently and honestly in the actual conditions of your actual practice, are the protection the tradition was preserving when it sealed its texts in clay jars, rather than allow the Archon system's institutional forces to reach them. The light is within you. The war is against it. The protection is available. Subscribe to the Gnostic Archive, where we name the war's forms every week, because named accurately and met with the specific practices the tradition developed. Those forms are no match for the light they are working against. The protection of the light is ultimately not a defensive posture. The Gnostic tradition was clear about this. The soul that orients itself primarily toward defending its developing recognition against Archon interference is the soul that has placed the Archon system at the center of its practice, rather than recognition itself. Defense becomes necessary in specific moments and for specific forms of the invisible war's pressure. But the primary orientation of the protected soul is not defensive. It is generative. The light that is genuinely developing, the pneumatic spark that is genuinely recognizing itself, protects itself most effectively not by erecting barriers against the Archon mechanisms, but by becoming more fully what it is. The Pistis Sophia describes this in the context of Sophia's recovery. As she recovers genuine recognition, the Archon powers that were pressing against her do not simply relent. They become progressively less relevant. Not because she defeats them, but because the genuine light she is developing is simply not the kind of thing that the Archon mechanisms can effectively operate against. The Archon system runs on the soul's identification with what it is not. As the soul progressively identifies with what it actually is, with the pneumatic spark, with the pleroma light, with the recognition that has always been available and is becoming more stably available through the practice, the Archon mechanisms lose the specific material they operate on. The best protection for the developing light is the development of the light. Practice the recognition, deepen the identification with what you actually are, and let the invisible war's forms become progressively less relevant as what they were fighting against. The soul's ignorance of its own nature is progressively dissolved by the recognition it was designed to prevent. Subscribe to the Gnostic Archive. The war is real, the protection is available, the light wins by being what it is. The Gnostic tradition's final word on the protection of the developing light is the word it uses for what the protected light ultimately becomes, a lamp. The Gospel of Thomas preserves it in saying 33, "What you hear with one ear, preach from your rooftops. For no one lights a lamp and puts it under a bushel or in a hidden place, but rather one puts it on a stand, so that everyone who enters and leaves may see its light." The lamp is not hidden to protect it. The lamp is placed where it can be seen because hiding light is a contradiction in terms. Light that is hidden is not functioning as light. The protection of the developing light is the protection of the lamp during the period when the flame is still vulnerable, when the archon wind of spiritual pride and fear of dissolution and external conflict can still extinguish it before it has reached the stability of genuine illumination. But the protection is not the lamp's permanent condition. It is the temporary shelter that allows the flame to reach the stability where placing it on a stand becomes not a risk but its natural expression. You are in the period of the lamp's development. Protect the flame during this period with the specific counter-practices the tradition developed, with the recognition of the invisible war's forms and the willingness to name them accurately as they arise, and cultivate the stability that protection makes possible, the stability of a light that does not require defense because it has become genuinely established as what it is. The Archon system cannot extinguish what has become genuinely established. The flame it was trying to prevent from becoming a lamp has become one, and a lamp placed on a stand illuminates everyone who enters and leaves, including the souls who come after you, looking for the transmission that the chain has been carrying since Adam called Seth close at the deathbed and whispered what the Archon system most needed him not to say. Subscribe to the Gnostic Archive. The lamp is lit. Place it where it can be seen.